listen. Can you hear me? So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk in this meeting. I'm really happy to, I just joined last year the biosciences, so really happy to insert myself into the BIFoR community. And today I'm gonna, so just disclaimer, it's not gonna be about an invasion very directly, but talk about modeling the 3D dynamics in a forest environment. Could be potentially used for invasions. Just put into context what this graph that we already saw by now, that I'm going to work with living trees. So there's like some few centuries all the way to the future, and probably looking into Anthropocene and future times. Also look into mostly tree trunks, but from sampling all the way to major and ancient trees. And just a disclaimer as well that we heard yesterday that everything in the forest is the forest. So actually we're gonna work with epiphytes and not what everybody realized, that epiphytes are long-living herbal plants that can take up to 20 years, even to mature, or 30 years to mature and flower, and can live like centuries as well, together with its host. So I'm gonna talk about a little bit, very short background about the canopy, and then talk about the forest model, and the epiphyte model, and the next steps in this modeling framework. So the forest canopy, we already saw, like in general, focus on trees and the forest, but as you might think, it also has a very heterogeneous environment for canopy dwellers. So even within the trees, in different branches or different leaves experience different values of environmental variables, like, for example, light, temperature, humidity, all the way to wind speeds and all things that we sort of already saw in this meeting. These also pose very strong physiological constraints on the plants themselves, on the trees themselves, that they might compete for light, temperature. They don't normally they don't compete, but they interact, and they might change their traits as well, and the physiology, as we already saw here. And obviously humidity cause a very strong influence on these plants as well. However, the trees, they are mostly attached to the ground, so they are able to access everything, nutrients from the soil and water as well. However, people don't realize that epiphytes, which are the plants that are attached to the substrate, so the host tree, they don't have access to the ground. So they normally live in this environment that's very heterogeneous. In a very short space, they experience a whole different set of environments, and they don't have the access to, let's say, the soil storage of many of the nutrients. So they are basically dependent on the air, humidity, on temperature, able to survive. And that causes a lot of adaptations for the epiphytes. Another thing that is important is that we all know that forest is a very dynamic ecosystem. So if you have gap dynamics and trees constantly growing branches and losing branches, that cause also very strong demographic constraint on the epiphytes, because they have to cope, they have to germinate, grow, mature, reproduce in very different conditions depending on how the substrate varies in space and time. So that makes a question: what is the influence of the forest dynamics on canopy dwellers? And here I'm focused on the vascular epiphytes, but you can think of non-vascular epiphytes such as lichens and mosses as well, but also invertebrates or vertebrates on this environment. And also that's also the question: so how can you actually depict the forest environment or the canopy environment realistically? You may be able to be useful to understand the use of the canopy dwellers of this environment. So for that, we came up with this model. It's a 3D functional structural forest model. And what does mean? I'm gonna explain a little bit short, is that you have instead of pixel, have a voxel in 3D space. You can vary the resolution, but here, let's say, is 1 cubic meter. And in this like a 3D space, we put the trees to undergo a series of ecophysiological processes. In a sense, when we initialize the model with, let's say, seeds or seedlings in the bottom half, and they will go like a series of demographic processes like germination. Says we use like seed bank that is neutral, so you always have things sprouting out. But depending on the light conditions of the environment, they would survive, or they have to speed up their growth and so on. Key points that we simulate photosynthesis and carbon simulation, and how it is translated into different parts of the components of the tree. This model is implemented in Java in a type of model. It's called GrowImp. It's originally done for foresters to simulate the yield of temperate trees. And it seems might be very realistic in a sense that if you see like this POV game engines where the player walk and you see these beautiful trees in games. So this type of language is coded in the type of Lindemeyer system that is devoted for modeling tree parts or plant components. There's all sorts of mortality sources. So they can go through carbon starvation. So if you have a negative carbon budget, the leaf will die, or the branch will die, or the tree will die, depending on the scale of the carbon starvation, but also stochastic events, and also gap dynamics. For big tree falls, you can kill all the lower trees below it. And it's a mechanistic model. That means that the parameters of all the processes, you can actually go to the field and measure and calibrate the model as well. So you have, for example, parameters for photosynthesis rate and even wood density to know how much of carbon needs to be allocated. Just a sample of the parameters. It is also structural. So that was the functional part. It's structural because you can also model how the different components of the plant, they are, let's say, put into relation to one another. So we have all sorts of structural parameters, and that, for example, include phylotaxis and angles, how the different branches are to one another, and how you can also play a little bit with tropism, like with phototropism or gravitropism as well, to change the shape of the tree as well. And the idea, so you can see how that works live for one tree, where you see the dynamics of the tree growing, getting the carbon from the atmosphere, producing the biomass, and the lower branches get starved, so they have self-shade, and they get shared by the tree, and so the tree grows. That's just a picture of the full stand that we can model. And the challenge was to, it was originally developed for, as I said, for plantations of temperate trees. So that the challenge was to simulate species-rich tropical forests. So we actually then used this model to seed different combinations of those parameters and get like a heterogeneous tropical forest. In this sense, the type of emergent patterns that we can get ranges from the tree components, so single branches, all the way to the forest stand. And then we look, because we wanted to use that for the epiphytes, we focus on the forest stand traits, emergent parameters. And then we took at here like stands variables from forest plots across the lowland forests in the American continent and in shaded area, and we try to calibrate the parameters to meet this, let's say, hypothetical average forest. The blue line would be in a larger simulated stand, The black line is a smaller, it's a half hectare simulated stand, or quarter hectare. And we were able to optimize for like snapshot variables, like the number of stems or above ground biomass or basal area, but also dynamic variables like primary production, or basal area growth, or reservation time of the biomass. Just to get a picture that we were able to optimize the model for the structure that we need that depict the lowland forest. So there are all other types of data that emerged from the model that we didn't optimize because there was a lack of data on that. But everything that I mean, if you have ideas to collaborate and use the model, please contact me afterwards. But there's a whole different ways to use the model. But the good part is that now we can actually use to simulate the canopy dwellers. So we then developed another model for the epiphytes, and for those that are not familiar, these are plants that grow on trees like bromeliads and orchids. You have one vascular epiphyte here in this the Britain temperate forest, the Polypodium fern. You can even see here some places in Birmingham. And these, people are not much aware of that, but they make up to 10% of the entire vascular flora in the world, and up to a third of the tropical flora. So it's a really large proportion of biodiversity. They are very important for both interactions and water and nutrient cycles, because they can intercept the rainfall and contribute for canopy soil and all the flowers. They feed on the pollinators and dispersers, so they're really important for the overall diversity in tropical forests. Still, they are largely ignored by any kind of biodiversity research. There's really few research on them. So in our 3D model, it's very similar to the forest model, and we simulate different processes, but more on the demographic side, because we want to understand the role of the substrate dynamics. So in this sense, we got the first output as input of the epiphyte model, and we simulate the demographic processes of the epiphytes on those trees. Okay, the results for the validation only have comparable data for two sites, one from Panama and one from Ecuador, and we were able to capture the peat canopy peak in abundances, and also got a very similar spread of vertical distributions of the different species or different types of epiphytes. Obviously, in the models like visual species, they're not really comparable to real-world species, but you could get this use of the canopy throughout. And that also resembles some what we also analyze in the field, that there's distribution depending on the functional traits as well. We also get a very similar value of mortality rate due to branch fall from a typical forest that we could compare with field data as well. With that, we run some scenarios where you simulate human impacts, for example, selective logging, where you have the typical forest in blue, and if you decrease the size of the tree, you can get almost a complete collapse of the epiphytic community. So you just by selective logging, you can basically lose a whole bunch of species in the forest, maybe up to a third of the species. If you decrease the fragment size, so you have here forests with different fragments, and you can see that the smaller the forest, the lower the abundance, the lower the species richness. We also simulate different forest dynamics. So if you mention like in a climate change, work on temperatures, you expect a higher overall turnover and biomass production. When you see here in gray, which is a higher dynamic, the blue is the typical forest. The other ones are the lower or the slower forest, mostly on the highlands owing for the temperatures. But you see if you increase the dynamics, you have a lower abundance and species richness as well. So faster dynamics, let's say due to warming or CO fertilization, means lower abundance and richness for the epiphytes just due to forest dynamics. But it's lower dynamics in highlands and polar climates have a higher values of those. Take-home messages that presented the canopy realistically help to explore canopy dwellers. Human logging and other activities may cause a serious decrease of biodiversity in tropical ecosystems. In the future, climate change may decrease these values as well. And please think of the canopy biodiversity from all the sort of purposes. Just before going to the final slide, the next step would be to use this model to explore the vertical gradients along elevational gradients and use that to explore how you can actually parameterize with field data and under different scenarios of climate change and human use of the forest. And stay tuned for postdoc after work by BIFoR as well with synthesis modeling soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Juliano, for this interesting talk. We will move now to a talk presented by PhD student Bradley Titley from the University of Birmingham, talking about biological invasion in the landscapes with or without roads, mathematical perspective.
I think you, yes, and then don't allow. Then don't allow. And then there we are. Can I do full screen on there? Just perfect.